All right, so here we go. Welcome everyone. I'm Roxanne Jurkevich of The Fit Musician, and I am speaking today with Daniel Padmos. Is that the correct pronunciation, Padmos?
Yes, yeah, that works just fine.
Okay. Daniel, I did not know about Daniel until rather recently. I watched him do a class online, and it was an amazing class. I was really impressed, and I knew I had to have him on the show. So welcome, Daniel. I would love for you to speak about yourself and give everyone a background, but actually, before we do that, I just want to say to anyone who's watching, if you have any questions, please type them in the chat. We'll try and leave time at the end for some Q&A. And if you do have a question, maybe even type it in caps, all caps. I know you won't be yelling at us, just, so that we can distinguish questions from anything else. I'm going to try and keep an eye on the chat. All right, here we go. Sorry, here we are. All right. And yeah, and I guess let's get going. So, hey, Daniel, how you doing?
Hi, good. Yeah, so I'll just keep it pretty brief. I grew up around New York. I grew up playing and as a classical clarinetist. So I went on to study at NYU in music performance, and then later got a master's at University of Michigan, also in clarinet performance.
Right.
So I very much grew up as a classically trained musician. It was my sole focus. I thought, okay, this is definitely going to work out for me. No problem. And so after my master's, I came back to New York, and I was starting to try to do the freelance thing and take auditions. And after about 2.5 years, I was starting to get a little snowball effect. And I started to see, okay, this is sort of possible. It's not what I thought it would be, but I could imagine like paying my rent, like this. And then in the end, I just decided, yeah, but I can also be happy doing other things. So maybe I'm going to leave this profession for the people who really, really, really need it,
Right.
And so anyway, I had this other passion that had been growing inside of me this whole time, because I was very athletic in high school. And I realized that many years later, I realized my approach to playing my instrument was extremely physical. And in the end, I kind of think that this was a limiting factor in my musical career, because I was so obsessed with, if I had good posture and felt good playing, my tone would be good, or the music would happen naturally, And I've since adjusted my opinions on that. Playing music, you need to be inside of the music. You cannot be inside of your body. So just to say a little bit about that. But having spent so many years inside of my body in relation to music, I found that when I switched careers, I went into physical therapy, and it was a really, really natural shift for me. I had first started doing some personal training after my master's degree to try to supplement my income. And I quickly realized that the clients I were getting were trying more so to look good than to necessarily feel and work well. I'm sure if I found the right clientele, that could have been a very different life story for me. But anyway, at the time, it drove me into the medical field, because I realized what I really was missing, what I really wanted, was to be able to help people in a profound way. So that's basically how I got into physical therapy. I found the body tuning clinic with Dr. Shmuel Tatz in New York City as some volunteer work for my program. I basically just Googled physical therapy for musicians. I found basically 2 places that were even mentioning it. One was, I believe, the Broadway Center for Performing Arts. And then there was this office, which was a private practice. I thought, okay, maybe I'm going to get a little bit better education here.
Right.
So that's how I ended up where I am. And that all happened. I walked into this office for the first time about 6.5 years ago. And at the time I thought, okay, this is exactly how I imagine physical therapy being. Very hands-on, very natural, just it makes sense in terms of feeling good, the approach here. And later I saw other clinics and realized, okay, there's this weird thing about strength training going on in the physical therapy industry. People were a lot of the therapists were trying to treat pain with strength exercises. And the approach that they were taking to that was fairly hit or miss. So that's more or less what I want to address today. Yes. Strength training for musicians, and also, strength training in general. What does that really mean? Why should you do it? And how to design a program that is right for you? Because most people will try to give you something that's less individualized than it needs to be.
Right. And, I find it fascinating, by the way, that you're a clarinetist. So as a clarinetist, that you are very physical in your playing. I mean, of course, I've seen, the occasional clarinet concerto, and the soloists, when they stand in front of the stage, of course, they'll move and they'll be more physical. But usually, because of the nature of the instrument of the clarinet, in an orchestra especially, you're usually sitting down and pretty static.
Boom.
Right. So to think of a clarinetist who was being physical while they were, or wanted to be more physical while they played, I've never even heard those two concepts, together.
Oh, yeah. If you want the direct example, I think you can YouTube my name. And if you look up, I did the Stockhausen in Freundschaft piece, which is more or less a performance art piece that's very difficult to memorize. I wouldn't recommend it for anybody. But at the time, I had a ton of energy at the end of my master's degree, and I really wanted to be unique. So I did this, and I'm very proud of it because it has my own choreography with there's minimal directives in the score, So I was also taking a modern dance class at the time, and I thought, okay, this is how I'm going to find my niche. I'll be the most physical musician anybody's ever seen. It's somewhere the music faded a little bit. I still play every day, but
Great. No, I'd love to watch that performance. And yeah, by the way, Stockhausen has written some percussion music as well, so I know him well.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I can't dance around the stage. I need to stay enclosed within my setup of big instruments.
Yeah, when you have so many sounds situated around you.
Yeah, that's a whole other animal. Fabulous. Well, I love that story and that journey of how you arrived to where you're at. Mm-hmm. So, in the class that I saw you do, which was not about strength training, really, but I was just curious if you wouldn't mind sharing. I kind of wanted to address this segment today, this interview, as far as if you could maybe describe, which is probably more or less logical to all of us, but what is good for people in general when it comes to health. I mean, just a sort of an overview, but then strength training for particular groups of instruments. If you would like to address that, but in the class that you gave, you talked about heart rate based training, mm-hmm. and nose breathing and mouth breathing, and I would love to hear that again, actually, because I'm sure that would be beneficial for everyone. But start wherever you're comfortable starting.
Okay. All right, let's try to tie everything all together with what I would consider is like the most important concept in life, which musicians are very familiar with, which is consistency.
Right.
If you consistently do things, you will adapt. And that is essentially the fundamental concept of all training and change in the body, right? So then you also need one other thing, which is a goal. If you are consistently moving towards a goal, you will make some type of progress. Right. Then you can get into techniques like this strength training technique is better than this strength training technique. Right. And then you may move faster or slower towards your goal. But really all that matters in the grand scheme of things, because if you strength train for a year consistently, you'll have an enormous change in your body, whether or not you were doing it 2000% correct or 75% correct, right? If you have good consistency and you know what you're working towards, you'll get results. So that's number one, because lots of people come into the clinic and say, oh yeah, I've tried meditating, it didn't work. You say, how long did you meditate for? Oh, yeah, I tried for like a week or two. Okay, yeah, no surprise, right? It's the same with the strength training. And the important thing is to understand that process needs to be gradual and it needs to take a while. Because if you come from 0 to hero, that's when you exceed your capacity by too much and you develop pain, discomfort, and psychological weirdness in the body, because now you're essentially hurting yourself with the training, which is not what you're trying to get out of any kind of exercise regimen.
Right, because a lot of people, just to interject, a lot of people don't realize, I've been guilty of this as well, that when we're applying stress to the body, when we are actually, overworking the body, if we spend 3 hours at the gym instead of maybe half an hour, or depending on what we're doing, or even running for an hour, it can be stress. I mean, there are a lot of things that we do that are healthy, but maybe not healthy if we're doing them for too long.
Totally. Exactly. So that's just baseline being a responsible human and taking care of your body in a responsible way. Most people overexercise for mental reasons. Everybody, in fact, everybody I know that overexercises does it for mental reasons, because they need to escape, they need to relax, whatever. We're not going to cover that, but that's supposed to be a separate issue that you deal with other exercises.
Right.
So let's say you're good, you're conservative, and you have a good routine, and you want to make gains. What is the goal that you want? Right? The goal is to feel pleasant, to feel strong, to feel stable, to not have pain. Right? Those are all the goals. To lift weight, bigger weight, to anything involving a number is not really a goal. That is maybe a measurement, but it's not a goal. The goal is to feel good due to your exercise.
Right.
Okay. So if you are playing any specific instrument, then the goal needs to be tailored to getting back to equilibrium. It's pretty clear that if you look at a flute player or a violinist, they're very crooked when they play. You can't not be. If you even take just your hands and hold them here, if you're not used to this position, you will immediately, within minutes, realize that these people are enduring something very strange, that they've adapted to gradually over time. Right? If you look at the arms of a violinist, always turned this way, right? If you keep turning the arms, you'll realize that your whole body starts to turn. And you see, even we can do this very quick example right now, where if we sit with the hands facing down on the thighs, and you close the eyes, and you just try to breathe just a little bit, but be very mindful of where the breath is going in the body. Okay, just take 2 or 3 breaths and notice where the breath goes. Easy peasy. Okay, now we turn the hands facing up. It may be more uncomfortable, but the palms now up in the lap. The palms resting in the lap, but facing up. And now you breathe in again and notice where the breath goes. And switch the hands back and again see where the breath goes.
Yeah, I can feel that.
Okay, so generally, if the palms are down, people are going to feel the breath lower in the body. It's activating more of the diaphragm. If the palms are up, you're getting higher breath. There's more rib cage and chest activation.
Yeah.
So even when I was first showed that exercise, I thought, wow, this is actually very profound. Right. Because if you consider what that means to have one palm up and one palm down to play all the time, what this is doing to your constant respiration while you play. Right? All these positions that we get into are changing the way that the basic functions of the body are working when you're in that position. If you're a double bass player, you're kind of always leaning around that instrument, always to one side. So you know that the lower back is always going this way for years. No surprise that some people get back pain from this. Right. Okay. So the question is, okay, so you play an instrument and you have a specific pattern associated with that. What on earth do you do with strength training? What is your goal for strength training to get yourself away from that pattern? Okay, so now we need to go briefly over the concept of agonist and antagonist in the body, which is basically the fancy term of saying what moves one way and what makes you move the other way, opposites in the body, right? Yin and yang, you could think of it however you want, right? So if you're a string instrument and you're always gripping, yeah, you may try to be relaxed, but it takes a certain threshold of pressure to get a clear tone. If you don't squeeze enough, the tone is muddy and the intonation is not clear.
Not to mention vibrato.
What's that?
For the vibrato that a string.
Oh, yeah, that's a whole nother element. That's very tricky for the ligaments of the fingers over time.
Right.
So let's say just baseline, right? If you're in a squeezing instrument, then you know that the forearm is getting a workout, whether or not you even feel it anymore.
Right.
For strength training, you simply just want to do the opposite. It's very straightforward. In that regard, when you look at the hand, it's obvious. You need to strengthen the opening of the hand with exercises like flicking, or you can use some of the resistance bands that make tension for you to push against. Okay, that's when you're into technique of strength training. And there are a gajillion wonderful personal trainers, including Roxanne, that can help you with exercises like that.
Thank you.
Okay. So you have this goal to create the opposite movement of your instrument. But if you look just at the hand, that's simple. But if you were to take the entire body as a whole picture, that gets quite a bit more complicated. So what I really recommend is for people, if they have a unilateral, one side of the body instrument, to try for 10 minutes to hold the instrument as if you were playing lefty, or the opposite, right? If you've been playing like this forever and you try to hold the violin even a little bit on the other side, you're going to realize how confused the body is, how difficult it is to be there. But more importantly, you're going to experience the opposite pattern. And this is where you can start to build your understanding of what the actual pattern is supposed to be and what the opposite of that pattern is supposed to be, right? If we are this way, the opposite is simply this way.
Right.
So then you're looking at either a joint by joint perspective on balancing the joints. That's one goal that you need to have in your strength training. And then you also need the other goals of strength training that are universal to all humans, which is building overall stamina, building strength in the core to be able to support various positions, using exercise to build recovery through blood flow. Okay, so what questions might you have now? That's already a bit.
Excuse me. No, I mean, that's all fabulous stuff. And it's funny, I just had this question occur to me when you talked about holding a violin in the opposite hand. I mean, I'm sure, obviously it's a great way to make one self-aware of just how screwed up our body is if we're a violinist, always holding it in this position, then doing it the opposite. But then I thought, aren't we just confusing the body even more by doing the same bad position on the other side? But of course,
Right. Yeah. I mean, in a weird way, you are and you aren't,
right.
Because it is confusing and it is starting to create tension in the opposite direction. But that's where the concept of balance comes in and symmetry for the body. Most of our pain and dysfunction comes from a lack of symmetry. There has been a large amount of research into the fascia of the body over the last 10 years. It's become a huge new phenomenon. Fascia blasters, myofascial tools, myofascial classes, fascial manipulation. Everything's about the fascia now, and for good reason, because it's that gooey spiderweb material that is basically your form.
Right.
So when that form gets accumulated or out of balance unilaterally, you need to start to show it the other direction so that it can start to balance out. Of course, you also need to do manual techniques or self-massage to try to release the old tissues, and then you can kind of reestablish other patterns. But since we're just talking about strength training, the goal is to strengthen all of the antagonist muscles to what you use when you perform and when you play.
Right.
So that's the step one, understanding your pattern well.
Right. Okay. I mean, I've been very fortunate being a percussionist in that usually when I play, I have a very ergonomic instrument. I mean, usually, unless I'm playing a particular, an Arabic drum or something like that, where my hands are in different positions, most of the time, especially if I'm playing with sticks or even with hands, percussionists, we have the advantage in that sense that there is we need symmetry in order to produce tones that are that are equal sounding on both sides with both hands. So, and that,
Totally.
yeah. So we're very fortunate in that sense. I mean, there are other little issues here and there, but just from a basic baseline perspective of position for even being able to produce sound, in that sense, I'm very fortunate. But yeah, no, I wanted to, if you wouldn't mind, and because I think this is what will interest people in this group. If I just sort of go down a list of instruments or instrument groups, I mean, I don't know if you could maybe make a few comments about what.
Sure, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, hit me.
Fabulous. I'm just trying to make sure I don't.
I love it. This is super fun.
This is super fun, right? Yeah, no, I just want to make sure I don't miss anything. So, all right, well, why don't we just start with the largest body, at least in an orchestra, which is usually the string section. You've already mentioned some stuff about violinists, and which I assume also applies to violists.
Yes, for sure.
So, if there's anything else you'd like to say about violins and violas, great. Otherwise, we'll move on to the lower strings.
Yeah, I would say this problem with the chin rest is very confusing for many players about should I fill in the gap with a custom chin rest all the way up so that my head is basically neutral. Meanwhile, you see other people who are playing like this and they don't have so much pain, so many problems. Right. So what's really going on there is this other concept that all musicians need to try to understand. In a way, Roxanne, you've been lucky with your playing positions, but not really just because of your instrument. You have to understand that your body is the instrument that you're playing. The physical instrument is supposed to become an extension of your body, but your body is the one doing everything and creating everything. So when you view the body as the instrument, you start to understand that there are different ways to play your body as well. Some percussionists come in with terrible neck pain because the way they play their body is like this. Right. You were lucky to play your body nicely. And that goes the same for string instruments too, right? There's a big proponent of over gripping. And so if you apply strength training to that, you need to over grip the other way just to get yourself close to equilibrium again. But if you don't change the way you approach your body when you play, it's hard to get around the chronic tensions, okay? But let's move down to the cello. Right. Because this is a great example where a lot of, if you look at an orchestra, they all use different cello angles. And there's a big difference between the way they use their spine, whether they're more rounded over the instrument with a hanging feel, or whether they're much more upright with more of a pulling and downward cutting feel to it. Okay, so both of those would be an extreme that are going to do problems for you over time. But if you decide, yes, the cello needs to be played with a hanging over feeling so I can get more of the weight of my arms involved, then you need to understand that the back is curving excessively when you play, which you're probably aware of. But then when you look at it in terms of strength training, now you need to understand you need to do the opposite. You need to start strengthening the opposite movement. You need, in that case, I would recommend exercises more like a deadlift or a compound movement that's going to really get the spine to strengthen and be able to stabilize when you're away from the instrument. When you need to play, you do what you do to make your best sound, right? And your level of personal suffering and sacrifice when you play is your business. I once had a clarinet teacher who purposely played on an extremely resistant setup. He said it was just, you could see the discomfort just blowing out of his face, just the amount of pressure in his body. But he said, I'm just willing to work a little bit harder for my tone than other people. Right. So, okay, that's first of all, that's your opinion of your tone as well.
Out and whatever, right?
Right. But what this is really about is how does that player feel at the end of the day after he plays for 2 hours? What does he need, or what can he do in the gym to make himself feel better, right? And if you look at it that way, the agonist of working that hard for the respiratory system, he's actually not breathing, relaxing the respiratory system. So his protocol to do the opposite of playing would actually maybe not be strength training for the core, since he's so pressurized all the time. He's probably got an extremely strong core already, right? So yeah, so that's, again, this is all about understanding what really works in your body when you play, what is doing the work, and then understanding what is the opposite of that, so that you can create the balance after you play however it is that you want to play.
So, for example, for cellists, obviously core work, back work, and then, I think maybe, what do you think about shoulder work as well?
Oh man, especially because also a lot of cellists use a lot of pressure from the bow.
Right.
Some of my more favorite sounding cellists don't use so much. They play with very little tension and somehow just get the instrument to sing. But some incredibly famous cellists that I've worked with, they adamantly use quite a bit of strength and pressure on the bow arm to get the contact on the string the way they want it to be. And now they're paying the price later. So if you look at that simple movement of turning the hand down to get the bow pressure, what is really the opposite? You're opening the whole system all the way through the shoulder, external rotation. What is the other movement they're doing? They're pressing down while they do that. Okay, so they're going down and in, essentially, moving the hand down and in to get the pressure. So the opposite, you're going up and out, and you work, not just stretching, but to strengthen this movement, right? To strengthen each part of that movement, the rotation in the forearm, the upward movement of the wrists, because you're always cranking down, the rotation in the shoulder, and the elevation of the shoulder. Exactly the opposite of what you do. Of course, the movement's more complex. You're moving through some various elements as you move along the bow. But in general, this downward pressure from the forearm is a big area for cellists to look at.
Yeah, and plus with cellists, with bassists as well, but the angle changes so much because depending on what string they're playing. So the arm will be closer or further away from the body, and especially going, just that extension and that pressure that you're talking about when they're pressing down.
That's right.
It's just a lot for their right shoulder to take.
Right. So if you look at it that way, in a weird way, you have to make the leap and understand, to create symmetry in the body, you sort of need to produce those movements in the left arm now.
Right. Exactly.
Right. Which is why maybe doing long tones lefty would be an interesting experiment.
Yeah.
I'm not saying it's going to help you play better, but it will develop your awareness and give you ideas about what you need to strengthen in the left arm to become more symmetrical, right? Because in basically all the string instruments, the left arm is doing some element of external and the right arm is doing some element of internal. So it gets more compounded the smaller the instrument, but you're more or less in that same corkscrew pattern.
Yeah.
Right. So the more you understand that, and the more you start to move the opposite way, the more balanced the whole body's going to become.
Right. And the same with the bass player, as you touched on before with the bass players, that they're also leaning one way.
Oh yeah, this is a huge deal. Yeah, because they're always leaning over with the bass on their left side, right, by the left of the neck. So this means that the left side of the lower back is always kind of getting extended, and the right hip flexor is always getting a little bit short. And so the lower back becomes this kind of like bowed forward banana into the right hip that becomes very irritating for a lot of career-long bassists. So then you're looking at, okay, do I play on a stool? Which sometimes can help, and it doesn't need to affect the sound. It's just a little different technique. I've seen many people get used to it. But more importantly, that's a big instrument that you need a specific body type for, and you need to be strong enough to handle that monster. So in that case, strength training for bassists, I would believe, is like almost more essential than the other instruments, because the bigger you're dealing with, the more you need it.
Right. Are there any specific, well, again, with the low strings, if we're going to sort of generalize what type of strength training, certainly some work on the shoulders, on the upper back, maybe the lats and the delts, just to make the upper body not muscularly strong, but just to have the resistance to be able to to put up with all this extending arm away from the body, and to make the symmetry in the left side as well.
Right. Absolutely.
I
Yeah.
mean,
So the other interesting concept, once you've developed a program and you're feeling good and you've acquired some more symmetry and maybe your symptoms are a little lessened, you can start to look at the concept of percentage of effort needed to play.
right.
Right? If you need to create strength, pressure in the body, if you need to squeeze something, let's take the fingers are a better example. Okay. They're a little simpler to understand. If you need to produce 3 pounds of pressure to get the string down, if your maximum strength can produce 30 pounds of pressure in the grip, then you're using a very small percentage of your work capacity to put the string down. If you can only create 6 pounds of pressure in the grip muscles, then pushing that string down on the double bass is requiring 50% of the effort from the muscles.
Right.
So in that sense, strengthening actually the prime movers makes you use less effort when you play, or it feels that way, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, but you need to grow that strength inside of the balance system, which is why if you're unbalanced currently and having symptoms, look for the opposite pattern and learn this. Then when you're feeling good and comfortable and you just want to feel like it's easier to play, then you exercise in a more balanced fashion.
Right. No, of course. I mean, it's basically logic to some degree. The better conditioned we are, then the less effort we'll expend in order to produce the tone and play comfortably. Again, I can only speak from a percussionist perspective, but for example, for lifting sometimes heavy instruments, just like crash cymbals, for example, to gain the control in an instrument like that. And especially when you need to play bigger cymbals, and these are two big plates of metal, and sometimes you need to play softly with them, because you're looking for a big sound, but a soft big
Right.
sound. And yeah, you've got to have control. And the way you get control is by some sort of strength training where your muscles are able to, bear that kind of weight, but it doesn't become a low, what am I trying? I'm looking a weight bearing problem. You know what I mean? It doesn't become like you're saying a high percentage of effort when it can be a relatively easy task if you are conditioned properly. So
right.
Let's move on. So your instrument, your clarinet section, the woodwind section. Why don't we move on to the woodwinds? I don't know if we should group woodwinds and brass together as instruments that require a lot of breathing control, breath control. Or, yeah, again, or if you find that it's better to separate. I mean, not all instruments.
I mean, I would honestly say once you get into, like, so far we've spoken about 4 instruments. Every wind instrument is basically just a different, has its own little niche problems.
Look, we could be here for the next 2 hours.
But let's break it down to what I think are the most under thought about parts of playing wind instruments, which are the two concepts. One is the work of the embouchure and understanding that you actually want that to be balanced as well. Even though, like on clarinet, you need a good amount of strength in the lips to get a good purchase, let's say a flexibly tight purchase around the mouthpiece. To allow vibration and control and all that, and shock absorption from finger jostling and all that. So then, okay, the lips are getting this massive workout, and there's this whole system in the body with the ring muscles that the working on the lips is so tied to eating and food and the throat and digestion that chronically working only one direction with the lips actually creates distortions down through the digestive system and into the lower ring muscles of the body. That's another interesting topic, right? So, but if we apply our basic concept of the opposite, right? Why does it feel so good after playing a long phrase? So nice to smile. right? But I would take that quite a bit farther and say, yeah, you need the strong embouchure, but in order to support that embouchure, you need to create the balance in the face. You need to strengthen and awaken all the muscles around that area that move away from that.
Right.
Because that balance together can grow into more and more and more strength. But if you never train the opposite system, you'll reach a plateau of imbalance and discomfort. The body will not let you gain more strength because it's too out of balance. Right. And this happens as a neurological reflex. So that is also why when you're strength training, you have to work both sides of the system, and maybe at first the opposite.
Okay.
Right? So that's to do with the face. People who play wind instruments need to understand that all this work in the lips affects the back of the neck and the jaw. I'm sure they're all too acutely aware of that. But what's really going on is chronic tension in your face, right? If you were just always doing squats, your legs would be sore. If you're always, then eventually you get numb to it, but the tension is there. So you need to start to massage the lips, keep everything flexible, work on the whole shape. Just like singers always are great because they don't have a choice. If singers get tight, they sound bad. But actually the same is true for all other wind instruments. It's just a lot easier to get around that and to compensate. Right. Except you suffer because you feel tight. And maybe your sound is still good, but you are not feeling good, which means you're not at your potential.
Right.
Right. Then the other concept for wind instrumentalists is how hard you're working with the breath, which there's a lot of variation in the instruments. If you're playing a low brass instrument, you're actually working quite a bit to keep the lungs open because you are going to deflate so quickly. So, the opposite movement for you is you actually want to work on getting that full exhale again and making sure that you're not getting caught in a puffed out rib situation where you exist chronically with the ribs open, because that's what you need to play, right? That's what you need to play. That's not what you need to live and feel comfortable. Mm-hmm. What you need is good flexibility in the respiratory system. Right. Then if you take a more high pressure instrument, like let's say clarinet or oboe, they're going to be getting quite a bit of back pressure, which can, if it's not managed correctly, cause strain throughout the throat and in the diaphragm, right? And a lot of that has to do with setup as well. Who doesn't love Arnold Jacobs? So I'm not saying you need to play with a lot of tension and back pressure, but a lot of people do. Mm-hmm. And what you need to understand is that the opposite of that is nothing, which is a very difficult exercise. To breathe, to not breathe is the hardest thing you can do.
Yeah, I was going to say, did you mean just not breathing, or did you?
That's right. That's right. Spending more time not breathing is the exercise that is the opposite of playing a wind instrument. So that means relaxing the breath out and not breathing.
This, by the way, does this really quickly? Is this what in your class that I saw you do? You talked about breathing. You had an exercise where you were saying count as many steps as you can take while holding your breath.
Oh, yes. Yeah. That would be a great example of breath.
Elaborate on that? Yeah. Do you mind just explaining that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, that gets more into the nose breathing and mouth breathing situation for recovery stuff, right? So the basic concept is that the more CO2 we have in our lungs, the more oxygen we will get into our cells and tissues. And this is because of the way the pH changes in the blood, and it allows oxygen to separate from hemoglobin more easily. If you hyperventilate and blow off all your CO2, your blood becomes more alkaline, and you actually the affinity between hemoglobin and oxygen gets stronger. So even though you're hyperventilating, taking in lots of oxygen, you're not able to unload it, which is why somebody having a panic attack needs a bag to blow into. So they get more and more CO2, the respiratory rate slows down, and they reoxygenate their brain and come back to equilibrium. Okay. This isn't to say that periods of alkalinity aren't good for you through certain breathing techniques, but in general, hyperventilation is a big problem, which is what we do when we play wind instruments sometimes, if there's big aggressive phrases, right? and you're taking more gas exchange than you need.
Right.
So basically the idea of walking like that is you're running out the CO2 sensor, and you're training that like an exercise to be less sensitive to levels of CO2 in the lungs. Because we want CO2 in the lungs. We want a high level of CO2 in the lungs. That means good release for the tissues. This also happens after you do exercise. Because of the metabolism in the body, all your cells, all the respiration is constantly producing more CO2 than you're used to for the hours after that exercise, which is usually why after a run, you feel the breathing is more calm. It's not because you huffed and puffed while you're breathing. It's because you're still generating CO2 in the aftershock. And that higher level of CO2 is actually allowing good oxygenation in the body, which makes you feel good and makes you not need to breathe. And you've also, because you flooded yourself with CO2 during that exercise, you've adjusted your sensor a little bit.
Also after concerts or after a show, right? Where, that's sort of that period of unwinding is probably where that's happening.
Totally. Exactly. I mean, that also has a lot to do with the adrenaline effect, which is a lovely experience.
Right.
Or it can be.
Right. So just since we touched on it, so the exercise was to practice this retention of.
Oh yeah, sure. So I'll give you the two quick examples.
Yeah.
Right. One is the walking exercise where you casually are breathing in and out, and then at the bottom of one casual exhale, you just stop breathing, and you count how many steps you can take before you need to breathe again.
Okay.
And your goal is to make this as high as possible. If you can make it to a 100, this is the real goal. But if you make it to 50, I'll be impressed. Okay. Now, the other aspect for wind instrumentalists and also string players, but basically everybody, I mean, this is a universal body concept, is that to rest the respiratory system, holding the breath is one exercise, but that's also stressful. It takes willpower. It's not necessarily restorative. That's like strength training for your CO2 sensor, which we know gives us better circulation when it's calibrated correctly. But if you want to rest the muscles and recover the respiratory system, what you need to do is create long periods with no breathing at a comfortable pace. And that means you can rack up that time piece by piece. So the simple exercise is to understand that the resting phase of breathing is at the bottom of the exhale, and you just try to stay there for a few seconds at a time. So we can do that together real quickly. You just make the breath very consolidated. So you breathe in a little bit, out a little bit, and now wait. When you need to breathe again, which is not for a few seconds, you do the same thing, in and out. Back to the bottom, and you wait a few seconds. Now I need to breathe again. Equilibrium at the bottom, okay? That's a big difference than taking long exhales that are oftentimes preached in yoga when you're working like,
Yeah.
It's working on the same principle, because if you do those long exhales in the course of 1 minute, you take 4 breaths, 5 breaths, something like this, right? But all that benefit is coming from that long exhale period where you're not breathing.
Right.
But you're still sort of doing work, which is good for the mindfulness and you're connected to the body. But on the baseline level, resting the system means exhaling into relaxation and resting.
So just so I'm clear, these were 2 exercises, or it's essentially the same exercise, but one you're walking when you stop breathing?
Well, let's say the one when you're walking, that would be like a max effort squat lift, where you're trying to push the boundaries of what you're comfortable with.
Right.
Okay. The second exercise is actually just how you're supposed to breathe all the time. It's just the way you're supposed to be. Right. And if you notice that you're a person that's constantly breathing in and out or constantly breathing through the mouth, you have a big problem inside of the body that you don't know about, and it's killing your energy system. Right. And if you start to spend time in and out through the nose, resting at the bottom, you will start to see, if you commit 10, 15 minutes to this, your whole body's going to change. At first, it will feel stressful, and then it will get warm and fuzzy. And later you'll realize, oh, muscles in my back started to release because they got oxygen. not by huffing and puffing, but actually by low level breath retention.
Right. It's almost analogous to when you want to lose body fat or you want to lose weight. And if let's say you're on a low carb diet, and then actually you need to eat some carbs in order to go back to losing the weight because you're spiking. I always get confused. Is it leptin?
I don't know.
Anyway, that so like stopping breathing is going to actually help you make, let you breathe more easily if
right.
Exercises. But so bottom line, in the difference of the two exercises, one is more dynamic, one is more static, right? You're taking a breath, you're exhaling, and then you're stopping breathing, and one you're moving, whether you're walking or whatever, and the other one you're not necessarily moving.
Correct. Yeah. In fact, you don't really want to be. Okay. It's a great thing to do when you're on the train or commuting or in the car, because you also don't want to be dealing with the conversation, because then you need to breathe to speak and you can't settle quite the same. I mean, you can when you get good at it. Like this whole sentence is one breath. Now it's time to breathe. But you need to practice a lot if it's not natural for you.
Understood. Now, just to finish the woodwind and the brass sections, we're almost finished with that. In the woodwinds, the bassoonists, besides the flute player who was holding the flute this way, bassoonists are positioned like this. So I guess this is another similar example to maybe the violins, a little bit different, but where both limbs are doing different things. And I guess they also will have to be mindful about doing the opposite on the opposite side of the body.
Yeah, ironically, something about playing a wind instrument takes a lot of the stress out of the shoulders because the ribs are in constant motion. And because of that, the shoulder blade never has a chance to really lock against the rib cage because the rib cage is always moving underneath the shoulder blade. So that pattern doesn't hit them as hard because the nature of their arm is dynamic mandatorily because of the breath, right? There's no way that you can truly lock your shoulder all the way to the hand when playing a wind instrument because you'll never get a freedom of breath then. I mean, you can, but most high-level players are not going to end up in that situation. They will have other weird quirks. For example, the bassoon, the hardest part is managing the placement of the head.
Right.
That is probably the biggest thing that I see with that, which can lead to a lot of back pain. So for them, the opposite movement, if they like to have the head more forward, right, they need to start to work to pull everything back again.
Right. Yeah, and then I was thinking in the brass section, I mean, trumpet players have their arms up all the time, and trombonists have this, thing going on. So yeah, everyone's got the different biomechanics happening, which I mean, trumpets, it's more symmetrical because obviously they're usually holding.
So yeah, but if you think about it, it's symmetrical only from the head-on perspective, right? If you look at it from this way, it's horrendously unbalanced, right? So in that case, yes, you're looking at movements that get the arms behind the body and working in that direction to make sure you can still do that. And I would say that's a very good insight there. A lot of the trumpet players that come get this like incredible bulked up, like matted down anterior shoulder region, and they really have trouble reaching behind the back because they're working all the time up like that.
Right. I mean, similar to a cellist, for example, who might be really embracing the cello a lot and, need to work on their back extent to balance out and gain that symmetry. Not symmetry on both sides, right and left, but front and back as well.
That's right.
And well, I mean, there's the entire realm of instruments that we could talk about. Obviously, there's guitarists, harpists who also sit down to play, and pianists. Just in general, just one last point. And I mean, percussionists, again, we discussed, we have usually a very fortunate, more ergonomic situation where our hands, our arms, our shoulders are usually pretty well, they have to be well balanced, and most of the time.
Right.
The biggest problem that we might get, I think, at least in my particular experience, is in some neck pain if you're practicing many hours and, looking down at a marimba or a mallet instrument or at the snare drum and watching your hands. I mean, I can always tell when I've been getting ready for auditions or just, working on a piece, and then just, I got to stretch my neck back because
Correct.
it's tight,
Yeah. And that probably is like a very natural response that a lot of people are familiar with. Like, the head is pretty straightforward. If you've been here for a while, the first thing you want to do is
exactly
right. So if you take that information and start to base your strength training routine in those natural reflexes, then you're working with what your body's already asking for.
right.
So if you find yourself playing and there's something you usually do afterwards that feels good or that comes naturally, like, oh, I have to put my arm out like this, to stretch my wrist again, right? Then that's a movement that you want to be strengthening because that's clearly something your body's asking for.
Right. No, so what I was getting to actually was just in general for instrumentalists who have to sit down to play, again, a pianist, a harpist, most usually cellists. Are there any sort of hip flexor exercises or, particular mobility from the waist down, that you could recommend?
Oh, yeah. I mean, to be honest, that has a lot more to do with how you're using the body when you play. It is very possible to sit and not make your hip flexors tight. If you're the type of player that likes to be up and forward, you're going to get a lot of tension in the hip flexors because you need to draw that pelvis forward in order to sit up. If you like to slouch onto the sacrum, you're going to get back pain eventually and neck pain with that. Okay, so that's really about finding the place where your pelvis sits comfortably and making sure, if possible, that you feel the weight of the legs going into the floor. You don't want to be holding the legs up. That's really about finding the.
Sorry, the volume went on. I was watching the Facebook just to see if there was anyone who had any questions. That was my next thing. Sorry to interrupt you.
No problem.
So the the hip flexors. I wanted to ask you that because that usually seems to be one of the main concerns that I find when I'm speaking to potential clients, especially if they are seated musicians. I mean, we all get quite sedentary when we're practicing because we have to sit, usually, sometimes stand for hours on end. But instrumentalists that have to sit to play, this is always one of the main, concerns, of course.
Totally. Yeah. So, I mean, the thing is, once you understand the opposite of hip flexion is hip extension, then you're into that technical realm where you're looking at, I could do lunges, anything to kind of work on the opposite movements. I would say probably like low unweighted squats are really great because a lot of times the hip flexors get tight, not because they've been in one position, but because they're not going through the full position. When we walk, we usually get some hip extension and the hip flexors can sort of loosen, but they can become weak, and especially if they haven't had the chance to flex all the way towards the chest again. So maintaining that deep hip flexion by doing low squats all the way, butt to the ground, or, working by flexing the knee to the hip and doing resistance there, basically training the muscle in that shortened range will actually make it a lot more comfortable in that middle sitting range and less likely to start to grip. So yeah, if again, you can take this approach with any problem. Once you've identified the pattern you don't like, hip flexion, I have too much of it in my body, you understand, right, I need to do soft tissue on the stiff part of the body. I need to strengthen the opposite movement. And then once I'm in balance, I need to strengthen both sides, hip flexion and hip extension through the full range of movement. Right? So that's kind of the pathway back. You release what is restricted, you strengthen the opposite movement, and then you strengthen both together. So that way your problems don't come back.
Got it. And then the final thing about about, well, anything that requires us to be sedentary, but especially when, it's our livelihood. And for those who have to sit to play most of the time, there's a circulatory issue, which is a whole thing unto itself. Yeah.
Maybe for a next session.
Yeah, absolutely. So, well, Daniel, I think this is a good place to wrap. I just want to shout out to some of my friends that I see. You know what? I was looking at the chat on the Zoom and I realized only you and I are on the Zoom. So my friends here, hey, Joel, Sophie, and Molly, thanks for watching. And if anyone has any questions, please let us know. Feel free to type in any questions that you might have. And if you happen to be watching this after the fact, feel free to ask any questions. I'll reach out to Daniel and get you a response post interview. But yes, Daniel and I are hoping to do some more talks and focus on different areas, whether it's breath work or circulatory issues or whatnot. There's a whole world out there of health topics to discuss. So Daniel, I just want to thank you so much. Everyone, please tell everybody where they can reach you and how they can contact you.
Oh, sure. Yeah, they can find, they can always email me at djp@bodytuning.us, or you can look us up in the city. We're Body Tuning and Physical Therapy. I think also if you look under Shmuel Tatz, Dr. Tatz, his name is a little bit easier to find us. But our website is nyphysicaltherapist.com. And you can read more about me there and how we're working here in the clinic. So
I'll post all of that. I'll post all of that if that's okay with you. I'll post it in the chat.
Yeah,
Let me see.
Yeah, and for the viewers, I would say please make specific requests, and we will design very specific programs, including exercises for you. Today was a good introductory lecture, but usually I'm more accustomed to leading exercises and giving you tangible experiences to go away with. So we'll probably move in that direction.
That would be fabulous. Thank you for offering that. And yeah, I mean, I think I already told you, I'm certainly looking forward to working with you when I go back to New York. I would love that. I think that's going to be a wonderful experience for myself. And everyone, you should go and work with Daniel. Go to New York if you're not in New York. Go to the Body Tuning Studio. And Daniel works with a lot of musicians and dancers who are based in the New York area, who work in the New York Philharmonic and the Metropolitan Opera and the ballet and all sorts of fabulous high-level artists. So I highly encourage you to seek him out as soon as, especially after this pandemic is over, when we can move more freely again between regions and cities and all that. But Daniel, I really appreciate your time. I know we went a little longer than we had anticipated, but this was so interesting, and really appreciate your generosity. And everyone, round of applause for Daniel. And thank you so much. I look forward to having you back on the channel. And yeah, we'll talk more. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. We'll talk soon, okay?
All right, take care, and everybody stay safe out there.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Mm.